Okay. All right. Give my screen a minute to load. Okay, so during this session, if you have questions, and I imagine occasionally there will be some about how this might work for your subject specifically, please feel free to ask. You can just unmute yourselves and talk, or you can type them in the chat column and I will go and check at points throughout this session, okay? But let's get started. So you're all here because you've all realized that criteria C is really important, but it's also quite hard to maximize marks in. So criterion C for your extended essay is 12 marks. It's the single largest criteria, and it's for critical analysis and thinking. And those marks can be quite challenging to get in most subjects, all right? So this is kind of the first place that students start to drop marks for their extended essay. So what we're going to talk about today is not good versus bad sources. I want to be really clear on that. Hopefully you're all familiar by now with what is a good source versus a bad source. We're not going to be talking about that. What we're going to be talking about is how you can use the data that you're collecting, present it back, analyze it to make the most of that data, to demonstrate your analysis and skill in using that information, not in just selecting that information, okay? So if everybody just pause with me for 1 second. I'm sorry, the problem with being the EE coordinator is I'm just getting messages about sessions not starting, so just give me 2 seconds. Sorry, it started. All right, sorry, back to you guys, I promise. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to talk a little bit about like where you start in terms of data, and that really starts with what is data. So you're all familiar with the idea that data is like numbers in tables, it's spreadsheets, it's graphs, it's quotes perhaps coming out of text, okay? But you need to keep quite an open mind as to what you can be referencing in terms of the sources that you're looking at. You should be referencing observations. You can be collating trend lines from looking at things like Facebook information, for example. Now, again, I'm not highlighting good versus bad data, but just the notion that it's lots and lots of different types of things. It's videos, it's images, okay? And all of these things contribute to what you can then use to justify the arguments you're making. And that's what you have to remember, is the point of the data you're using is not to say, oh, look, somebody else agrees with me. Sometimes that's the point of a source, is to say, oh, look, they agree with me. But actually it's to provide you with a piece of information that alongside another piece of information helps you reach a new conclusion, okay? And as we talk about what critical analysis really is, hopefully you'll get a better idea of what you need to do with that data that you're collecting. Because if you're simply taking a table or taking a quote and transplanting it into your essay and going, here, look, somebody else said this, you're not actively engaging with that data. You're literally just representing it. And I don't need to read it in your work because I could read it in theirs. Like they already published their data. So it's important that you consider the way you use all of your sources as involving some form of transformation. They shouldn't just come into your work and be presented as is. You need to do something with them, whether that be agree with them, disagree with them, dissect them, compare them. You have to do something with it. You can't just kind of, and this statement, insert reference, and this statement, insert reference, okay? Which is what lots of students will do. And that's why they lose those critical analysis marks, okay? So step one, be really clear about where your data is coming from and what kinds of things count as data. For example, you might be using a source and their studies, but did you ever consider that you could actually do a count of how many different articles talk about a particular topic, and that becomes a piece of data? Like 60 different authors from the US are currently researching topic A. That's relevant, and you can tell us that without even reading much of any of their articles, just simply by looking over the general topics that they're talking about. So be aware that where you're getting your data and what counts as source data is quite varied. But this is the important part, breaking it down. Like, how do you actually analyze data? What do I mean by that? So we're going to look at some tools next, some specific, like, actual how you use them tools. And just in case you miss anything, when you look at the slides for this presentation, in the presenter notes, I've got the instructions for how to use each of these tools, just in case you get stuck, okay? So before I show them to you, these tools are great tools for analyzing individual sources or for analyzing sources against each other. You do not need to use all of these tools, and you certainly don't need to use all of them for every source, but you should be using at least one, if not two, on every single source, okay? And that's going to sound like a lot of work, but that's how you actively engage with your sources. I know some students kind of start collecting data and they think about their essay and they're imagining themselves with perhaps 20 or 30 or 40 references in their list. But if you're using 40 references in an essay that's 4,000 words, chances are you're not analyzing 40 references. You're just referencing them, and that's of less value. You're better off having, say, 15 sources across 4,000 words that you actively have analyzed and engaged with. So let's look at the tools anyway. So the first tool is super simple. It's highlighting. But it's not just picking one color and like going, oh, this seems important and this seems important and this seems important, and copy it out and paste it. If you did my first workshop today, you know that the copy-paste system is important. But what's more important in terms of critical analysis is finding a set system for highlighting and analyzing information as you read it. So every time you read a source article or a piece of research or a piece of news media or some data, you need to have a way for mentally processing what's something that, for example, is quotable, what's something that is data to be transferred or analyzed, what's something that maybe goes against your arguments, what's something that supports your arguments, because then it makes it really easy to break it down into the relevant parts of your essay later. So having an effective highlighting system, like tool number one, everybody should be doing that. Everybody, okay? Whether you use any of the other tools is relevant, but you should all be using the highlight system. Beyond that, these other tools, you can use one of them, you can use a couple of them in conjunction, but when you use them, you then have to kind of talk about it in your essay. So let's talk about tool number two. Tool number two is about ranking. When you look at your sources, you should have more than one source about every point that you're making. So if I'm going to make the statement, it is less risky for McDonald's to enter a new market than it is for GYG, okay? I need to have more than one source that is about that topic. They don't both need to agree with the statement, but they both need to be about the statement, okay? Because if I just have one source that says, yeah, that's true, I've got no weighting, I've got no point of comparison, I've got no way of considering other arguments, it's shallow, okay? If you think back to some of the stuff you've done with Kurt about research, you'll remember that he's talked about finding kind of the triad of truth. And that's that notion that, you know, to make a strong point, you need three sources that kind of come together to prove it. And that's true. But anyway, so what that means is that for any given argument you're making in your paper, or any point you're trying to make or idea that you're sharing, you should have a few sources that tackle that idea, either positively, negatively, whatever the perspectives are. And then you need to compare those sources. And so one way you can do that is with a ranking system. A ranking system might be ranked on reliability, so the most reliable source to the least reliable. You could rank them by considering how relevant they are, so contextually relevant. So if we look at if we look at an example about, let's say I'm interested in phone sales in Singapore. If I have a study about phone sales in Singapore, that's really relevant, like massively contextually relevant, because it's literally what I'm looking at. But I might also have a paper about phone sales in China. That's less contextually relevant, but it's still relevant. I might also have a research paper on phone sales in the UK. that's probably even less relevant, okay, because the context becomes so different. So I would rank them most relevant, the study here in Singapore, least relevant, the study done in the UK. And that then allows me to give strength to the conclusions of those studies. So I would then make an argument that says, well, even though the UK study disagrees with the Singapore study, I would expect the Singapore study to be more relevant to my argument because I'm talking about Singapore. And that's how I would talk about it in my essay. Like, my paragraphs should encompass that kind of discussion about the value of my data, okay? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes now, not very long, just a couple, to, with the source article that you've selected, that you've prepped or that you picked up at the start of today's session, just on a piece of note paper or on your screens, like on a doc, I want you to type out, like, do you have any other articles about that topic? Like, do you have any other sources that cover a similar thing? That's the first thing. So have a think, look at your source. Do you have any other sources that match that source? And once you've considered that, I'm actually now going to give you a few minutes to go into wherever you're storing your sources to do a quick peruse over your data to see, with the other sources you have about the same issue, topic, or idea, how might you compare them? You don't actually have to rank them in any way, but might you compare their reliability, or might you think about, for example, the relevance of one over the other, or might you think about timing? So is one older and younger? Just have a little bit of think. I'm going to give you just a few minutes to do that, but head into where you're storing your sources and have a look at that. If you don't have a place where you're storing your sources, as I say this, instead of doing the ranking activity, go and find a space and make it your designated source storage and start moving things to it while other people are looking at their ranking systems. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Off you go. All right. Just going to exit out of here and come back to you guys on the screen for a second. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. If you're happy to turn your camera on, who wants to raise their hand if they didn't have any other sources that were like the source that they selected this morning? Like, it was kind of their one source about this point. Hands up if that's you. You didn't have anything else. Anyone? Hands up who had at least 2 other sources about similar ideas or topics. Good. Really good. Okay. And that's really important. Okay, so hands up who decided that they might be relevant to rank their sources via reliability. Was that relevant to the ideas you were looking at? Couple, okay. Who thought something like relevance was a better way to rank the sources they were using? Good, okay. And that's the whole point. You're not going to use all of the systems, but you have to think about the ones that might be appropriate in your own discussion. Okay, that's really good. All right, let's head back. So tool number 3 kind of relates to tool number 2 in that tool number 3 is all about doing a comparative. So if you have, generally this is if you've got 2 or 3 kind of key sources that you've now decided you want to discuss in context. So you want to discuss them together when you talk about this point. It's a really good idea to sit down and just do a quick comparative analysis of those 2 or 3 sources. So by that, I mean, you want to think about things like, you know, what's the author background for the research? What were the sample sizes like for any studies that they undertook? Are there any contextual differences like location, culture, etc.? You know, are there any reliability differences? Is time frame a factor? Just a general analysis so that if there are any relevant comparative points of discussion, you can then bring them in. Now, you're not going to do 2 and 3 for every source, okay? You might pick and choose based on what's appropriate for your particular info and for the particular argument that you're making at a given point in time. So 2 and 3 are all about how you put your sources together. Tool number 4, feedback, is about analyzing an individual source, and tool 5 is the same, okay? So for feedback, what you're going to do is you're going to imagine that you're the teacher, okay? For a change, you're the teacher, and you're going to be feeding back on the source that you're reading. And I recommend putting yourself into this mindset because it's really easy to read an academic source and go, this is a PhD researcher who knows what they're doing. Obviously, they're right. And quoting it as gospel, okay? But they're not. There are plenty of stupid researchers out there. And there's plenty of really, really rubbish research, okay? Just because someone gets a title or it gets published even, does not necessarily mean that it's the best piece of research on a given topic or that it's even a particularly good piece of research on a given topic. So feedback is about sitting down with a particular source, and this is good if the source is something you're going to use heavily, so you're going to rely on it a lot, okay? Or if it's a source that you really want to discredit. So in other words, it contests the point that you're making, but you still feel like your point is right and you want to make sure that they understand that this source is rubbish and therefore it should be ignored, okay? You're allowed to tell people that, but you need to critique it and explain why. So in feedback, you're looking for things like, were there holes in their argument, things that they didn't discuss? Was there sampling issues, like how big a sample did they actually test? I read it was a really bad research paper, but it's a great example of this. Research paper about 8 months ago, and it was all about, ironically enough, it was all about online learning before we knew we were going to do this. And the study was all about how it was completely easy to implement a particular assessment model in classrooms. And the conclusion of this paper was basically that this is what all schools should do, and it was fabulous and it would work everywhere. When you actually looked at the paper and you looked at the study that they conducted, they tested this model on a grand total of 60 students across only 12 teachers in a very small region of China. That was it. So while their conclusions might be relevant to that very small sample, global relevance is probably a little bit questionable, okay? But it was published, it was a presented academic article, the researchers are well respected, none of that is wrong, but it had some holes that you then might want to critique. And so that's something to think about if you want to really hack into or demonstrate your point. It's worth remembering that when you're trying to prove a point, sometimes it's not just effective to provide supporting arguments, but also to point out how weak the contentious ones are. Like, think of it like this. When you're fighting with someone, you don't just want to tell them why you're right, you also want to tell them why they're wrong. And this is exactly what feedback is about, okay? And you can bring that into your paragraphed arguments. Tool number 5. Tool number 5 is a straight up source analysis checklist. Like, it's a document, there's a link in the slides when you get them, and it literally just asks things like, who is the author? What is their background? Is there potential bias? When was this written? It's a really standard source analysis questionnaire that you could do on every single source that you plan to reference. This kind of tool is really useful if you're not sure where to start with your source analysis. You're not kind of sure what ideas might come out. And so if you feel like that, like if you feel like you kind of don't really know where to go with the comparative and you want to feed back, but you don't even know where to begin looking at things that might be wrong, source analysis questionnaire, take out a source, use the questionnaire, fill it in. It's that simple. And then see, is there anything in those responses that you come up with that make for good contributions to the arguments that you're going to use, okay? The last tool on this doc here is the if this then tool. If this then is all about how you take some of these ideas you found in this other source analysis, so in 1 through 5, and kind of build it into the end of your paragraph. So every point you make in your essay, argumentative point, I don't mean like background info, but every time you present an idea, okay, that you want the reader to be persuaded by, the last part of that idea should be presented as sort of an if this statement. So it goes like this. If this point that I'm making is true, what does that mean for my overall question? So if I make the point that it is riskier for Grab to expand into Thailand than it is to expand into Taiwan, okay, I might have used evidence to support that point, okay, and then my question is all about where should Grab expand. So if the statement is true, it's riskier to go to Thailand than Taiwan, then Grab should expand into Taiwan. Okay, I'm connecting my source with my evidence and relating it back to my question. Okay, and that's what the if this then is all about. Okay, connecting what you the conclusions you've reached to your question. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of practice time. See? But I'm going to leave this slide on the screen so that you can do this with some guidance in front of you. So you can pick any one of the 6 tools, probably 1 through 5. And I'm only going to give you about 5 minutes to do this. But just with the source that you've got, okay, why don't you try either feeding back on it, okay, or you could Google just a source analysis template if you wanted. You'll find some that are similar to this, okay, or you could just use try a highlighting system like key ideas, arguments 1, arguments 2 kind of system to analyze that source that you've got in front of you. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, so you probably won't get through the whole source, but spend 5 minutes just reading through it, making critical notes, like what do you agree with, what do you disagree with, where might there be the gaps, okay? 5 minutes, off you go. If you have questions, feel free to ask. All right. So hopefully you kind of started to get an idea that you're not just kind of mining a source for its data, you're critically evaluating the source itself. How valuable is it to you as a piece of data? You know, what does it offer? What are its limits? And just in case you're still struggling to see how that fits into your essay context, I just want to go through a scenario with you to help you kind of better understand the point of this. Every time we talk about an argument, a claim, an idea, okay, it's got to fall to one side of the spectrum. If I make a statement, it's true or it's untrue, it's significant or it's not significant, it's positive or it's negative, it's got a side, okay? And my job when I make that claim is to convince you of a particular side. And I do that by presenting arguments, okay? I present a range of arguments. So if we think of your question, you've got your question and you probably have a hypothesized conclusion. You probably all think you know what your answer is going to be. And so your job with your essay is to provide arguments for and against that. But each of those individual arguments, those bits of evidence, are going to have different weights. They're going to have different degrees of strength or influence. So I'm going to use an astronaut analogy to do this. Now, if you are a physics student, please do not correct the gravity scenario going on here. I know it doesn't work like this. It's just a metaphor. So just ignore it. Anyway, so with a stated claim, just an open, this is what I think, okay, your astronaut floats in the middle. There's no kind of pulling tensions there. And then you start to present arguments. So as you start to present them, okay, some arguments will be bigger, some will be smaller, but they'll start to pull your astronaut towards them. They're convincing, okay? The gravitational pull is the persuasiveness of those bits of evidence. Now, the more bits of evidence, the more persuasive, okay? We already know that. You guys do this all the time. Every time you write any kind of evaluative answer, if you're in my econs class, you've heard this a lot, we talk about balance, you know, putting arguments on both sides. And often what students do is, you know, 3 arguments on the left, 3 arguments on the right. Conclusion. The problem with this is it doesn't necessarily factor in strength because, I mean, I have arguments on the right. Oops, wrong way. But I also have arguments appearing on the left. And as they appear, he starts to float back to center. Now, if I put more arguments on one side than the other, so in this case, I've got 5 arguments on the untrue side and 4 on the true, we can make an obvious kind of, we're going to lean towards the claim being untrue. But sometimes it's not the number of arguments that's important. Remember, I said that strength was a factor. So what could happen, I could have no arguments on the true side, or I could have one giant argument on the true side. And by giant, I don't mean like lots of info. I mean, it's so completely persuasive that there is no alternative. Like it just is. There could be 6 million arguments against it, but fundamentally it's true because there's no disputing it. It's an indisputable point. Now, obviously, most things don't have an indisputable point, but some things are more persuasive than others. I'm going to give you an example here, and it's a business example. I'm sorry to those who don't take business or econs, but it just works nicely for this scenario. Let's say that your question is around, should a business decide to expand into a new market? Okay. Now, my claim, yes, the business should expand into a new market. That's the claim I'm working from. Now, I'm going to have arguments against that. It's risk, there's significant financial cost, okay? The market might be really unpredictable that you're looking to move into. There might be cultural gaps, which will make it really hard to enter that market. So I've got 4 pretty strong reasons not to do it. An interview with the CEO is a piece of source data I'm going to use, and the CEO wants to do this. It's their only goal for the year. 4 arguments against moving, 1 piece of evidence supporting moving. What do you think is going to happen? The company is going to expand because the CEO is a key decision maker and has decided this is what they want to do. It's going to override everything else, okay? So this is where we talk about significance, and significance kind of, excuse my animation, significance, it also fits into this if, this, then statement. So, you know, if this is true, if this is untrue, how important is it? So every time you conclude the use of a source or an argument or a point that you're making, how significant is that point, or how strong is that point in supporting your claim or answering your question? Okay, that's the whole point of source analysis. Now, the last part, obviously, aside from just analyzing and breaking the source apart, as we've been talking about so far, is how do you then present it back in a useful way? Partly, you do this through quotes, but you need to keep them to a minimum, okay? Quotes should only ever be used in 4 scenarios. If the language of the quote is spectacular, like the way they've said it is just, you just can't repeat it without, yeah? It's memorable, it's very effective, it's succinct, then quote it. Or you want someone else to say exactly what you're saying, like you're making argument A and they making argument A. Insert quote here. See, they said it too. Okay, that's fine. If you need to further analyze the text itself, okay, so particularly if you're doing like English or something, you might want to break down, or if you're doing politics and you want to make a comment on a politician's speech, okay, you might put in a sample of what they've said and then analyze that quote. Or if someone has presented an argument in a paper via a series of points, like, I'm going to convince you that this is true via points 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you, writing your essay, are going to say, here's what they've said in points 1, 2, 3, and 4. Here's why they're wrong, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, they're the only times that you should quote. But just in case you're stuck on that, on the slides you'll see there is a reference link there to a site that talks about when it's appropriate to use quotations. And I've also put a link to when and how to use paraphrasing more effectively. So that if that's a skill set you feel needs work, please have a look at those links later on. But for right now, you should also be thinking about visuals. When you're presenting an argument, often a visual is a much more effective way to get your point across than text is. Like if you want to tell me that 70% of studies show A, give me a graph, for heaven's sake, because 70% is obvious on a graph, okay? Also, it saves words. And by the time you get to your 4,000 in this draft, trust me, you're going to want to save words. So visuals are powerful. Think about how you can use them. Images, graphs, okay, diagrams. Make the most of them. They're helpful. But given this is a 4,000 word essay, largely you're going to be writing text. So on the screen in front of you, I have 3 boxes of text that make use of sources, okay? And they make use of them in differing degrees of success. We're going to start with the red box. In my red box, I've got 2 quotes, one following the other, followed by a summary statement that's not massively helpful, okay? This is not good use of sourcing, but it's what lots of students will do. Here is my quote. Obviously, this is what it says, done. Firstly, never, ever start a point, an argument, an idea with the quote. Ever. Your opening to a point should be the idea that you're expressing in your words, in a topic sentence, followed by the evidence. The quote should never be the front line. It should always be the backup, okay? And when you're thinking about your paragraph structure, keep that in mind. Quotes, source data, it's the backup. It's not the main show. You're the main show. If I wanted the data to be the main show, again, I would read the original report. Okay, so number 3, not so great. Let's look at number 2. Rogers suggests in her paper that all these are orange. This means that the results of observations below can be considered accurate. This is better, and it's better for 2 reasons. 1, I'm not wasting words by quoting. I'm just summarizing it up in my own statement. And 2, I'm referencing 2 sources of data that agree with each other, and I'm making that point. It's still not ideal, because from this, I don't really know what the point was. Like, am I caring about these being orange? I don't know. Is that where we're going with this? I should have started it with what's the point I'm trying to make, and the point I'm trying to make should have been clear and then connected to the orangeness of the bees. Let's look at the green one. Companies expanding into new markets often have to take risks to be successful. Such risk should not be a reason to discount the opportunity. That's my point, okay? Now, my question when I wrote this, as I was imagining all these scenarios, was probably something along the lines of, should a business take risk to enter new markets? Or should a business choose to enter a new market? It could have been even broader. And then one of my points is, yes, they should, because if the opportunity is there, the risk isn't worth avoiding. And then I support it with evidence. I've got my McDonald's scenario there. I've got my reference, and I'm using 2 sources to support it. Okay, but you'll notice that neither of those references use the word risk, because the source data wasn't about risk. It was about things that provide evidence about risk, but it wasn't explicitly about risk. And this is where we come right back to the start of today's session, where I talked about what is data and what sources are you looking for, and remembering that you're compiling information to then use. You're not compiling it just to represent it to me, okay? So what do multiple different factors tell you about the whole? Okay, the fact that McDonald's entered into India, despite significant cultural differences, okay, and were able to develop a new product range and achieve success eventually, tells me both that they faced some serious challenges, but also that they were able to be overcome. And that's the point I'm making. But I didn't Google McDonald's and risk to find that. Okay, that's not what we want to do here. So when you're doing critical analysis, you want to be using multiple sources supporting your new idea. Think of it like a triangle. The 2 sources or more, it can be more sources, but your sources at the base come together to prove the idea that you're sharing, your point, okay? Which is why effectively after you've done your reading for your essays, you can actually stop and you should be able to sit there and go, what are my main arguments? Not what do my sources say? They're just evidence I'm going to use for your main arguments, the points you want to make, okay? Last thing we're going to talk about, in case that last slide wasn't quite clear enough, basic paragraph structure. It's got 3 parts. What is your argument? That should be all you. Explain it in relation to theory, case study, example, evidence. That should be quotations, paraphrasing, referencing to your sources. Lastly, in relation to my overall question, this is significant, insignificant, a strong argument, a weak argument. That's you again, doing that critical analysis. It's strong because this author had a lot of samples, had a significant sample size. Or it's weak because it's not very contextually similar. See where I'm going with this? So I'm pulling all of those tools together to formulate what is basically just a 3-step paragraph system. Okay? Now, it's 10:43. I'm going to stop sharing this here. I'm going to come back, escape. Come back onto here, and we're going to just about finish up, but this is what's going to happen. It's 10:43, so if you want to stay on and ask questions, you can in a minute. Before you do that note, though, you need to take your second screenshot bingo of the day. So can everyone please turn their cameras on for 30 seconds? Ah, good work. All your lovely faces. Brilliant. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Screenshot bingo! Okay, seriously? I know you're tired and there was lots of information there, but you can all do so much better than that. Everyone unmic yourselves, like unmute yourselves now. Mic's on, come on, mic's on. Everyone, unmute, unmute, unmute. Okay. 3, 2, 1, everybody is gonna yell bingo. 3, 2, 1.
Bingo! Bingo!
All right, if you have questions, please feel free to stay on. Otherwise, you can exit. Remember, you've got a couple of hours now of study time on your EEs. I will have a help session open from 11 a.m. So if you want to pop back in later, you can. But other than that, if you've got no questions, feel free to head off. I will share the resources with you later today. I hope that was helpful. You can head off and get some awesome EE stuff done. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Miss Lynn.
Bye.
Thank you.